We're beginning in the Middle East, where death toll from Israeli occupation in the West Bank has risen to 17. This was confirmed by Palestinian official news agency Wafa. According to Wafa, 8 people were killed in the city of Jenin, 4 in Tubas and 5 in Tulkam. Earlier today, the Israeli Defense Force said its troops killed 5 Palestinian terrorists in a firefight. The terrorists, they say, were hiding in a mosque in the city of Tulkam. This revelation was made in a joint statement by the IDF, Shin Bet Domestic Security Agency, and Israel Border Police. The IDF says one of the people killed in the West Bank overnight was head of a local terrorist organization, the Nur Shams, identified as Mohammed Jabbar. It adds that one of the Israeli officers involved in the exchange was slightly injured and was taken to hospital for medical treatment. Meanwhile, the United Nations is still very concerned about the situation in the West Bank and issued yet another call for the Israeli Defense Forces to end what it calls its operation there. UN Security Secretary General Antonio Guterres has urged Israel to put its counterterrorism operation to a stop as it's fueling an already explosive situation. In a social media post, Mr. Guterres strongly condemned the loss of lives in the West Bank, including that of children. In a separate development, the European Union says it's considering starting the process of imposing sanctions on some Israeli ministers. This was relayed by the foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, who was updating journalists ahead of a meeting in Brussels. According to Mr. Borrell, the bloc has initiated a procedure to see if member states would consider it appropriate to sanction some Israeli ministers over hate messages against Palestinians.
The conversation for a ceasefire has been sliding from one day to another without getting any result, and in the meantime the bombing continues and the number of civilian casualties increasing. And at the same time, it's still more worrisome, the call from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel to displace people from the West Bank, doing more or less the same thing that they did with the people in Gaza. This is completely unacceptable. And I hope that the ministers will raise their voice against the situation in Gaza, in the West Bank. As you know, this is not an executive meeting. No decision will be taken, cannot be taken because it's an informal meeting. But certainly, I initiated the procedures in order to ask the member states if they consider appropriate, including in our list of sanctions, some Israeli ministers has been launching hate messages, unacceptable hate messages against the Palestinians, and proposing things that goes clearly against international law and is an incitation to commit war crimes. And I think that the European Union has not to have taboos in order to use our toolbox in order to make humanitarian law respected.
The VOA's Ricky Rosson is in Tel Aviv. Ricky, great to see you. Let's begin with the EU foreign policy chief's proposal to impose sanctions on some Israeli ministers. How is that being perceived back home in Israel?
The Israeli government, in which the 2 extremist ministers are part of the coalition, is furious that the EU would propose sanctioning any elected officials in any country. In fact, the 2 ministers in question, Finance Minister Smotrich and National Security Police Minister Ben-Gvir, have been provoking opposition even inside the Israeli government, both for their remarks and for their actions. For example, Ben-Gvir's visit to the Temple Mount, which is holy to both Jews and Muslims, has been condemned by the head of the Shin Bet, the Internal Security Service, and even the Israeli Defense Minister as dangerous provocations.
Right now, apart from the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whom we already know Israelis are upset with, and that's because he still hasn't fulfilled his promise of returning those hostages. Which other Israeli ministers are in the eye of the storm as regards the operation of this war in Gaza and now in the West Bank?
Those two ministers that I mentioned before, and other ministers from their parties who are extremist far-right politicians, have made remarks that could strengthen the international charges of genocide against Israel that have been brought to the International Court of Justice. The finance minister Smotrich said that he thought it was moral to allow Gazans to starve while the hostages are being held. And Ben Gvir objects to Israel providing Gaza with fuel or aid.
Again, we're learning, Ricky, of the concern from the United Nations warning Israel to back off from the West Bank. A concern is heightened by the possibility that children are being killed in this operation. You said yesterday the IDF said it was being careful about civilians. Who's keeping them accountable in this operation?
Well, I still think that the IDF is being careful, according to what we hear from the IDF spokesman and Palestinian sources as well, because it does not want to create a situation in the West Bank like what it has done in Gaza by destroying huge amounts of infrastructure and Palestinian homes. They are continuing to maintain cooperation with the Palestinian Authority security apparatus, which has kept the West Bank relatively calm compared to Gaza. And I think they want it to remain that way because they can't afford another front besides Lebanon and Gaza to fight in.
And according to the Palestinian news agency WAFA, the death toll from the West Bank already is at, I think, 18 at the last count. The numbers are increasing, of course, with the number of casualties in the hospital. Does the IDF have a counterclaim as to these numbers of the death toll?
I think you mentioned previously that the IDF claimed, or maybe the Palestinian Authority claimed 17. There were 12 killed on Wednesday, yesterday, and another 5 in the gunfight with Hamas, Islamic Jihad militants who were trying to hide in a mosque today in Tulkarem.
I also wanted to speak wanted you to speak to accusations by the Palestinians that Israeli authorities have taken over communities in Gaza with no intentions of leaving.
Well, the Israeli army has returned over the last nearly 11 months. The Israeli army continues to return to areas in Gaza that they had fought in and concluded their operations, but they say that Hamas militants are regrouping, and so they go back into these neighborhoods. And they've done this continuously. Usually the operations last for a week or two, and then they move on to another area. But you may be referring to Netanyahu claimed that he wants to permanently occupy the Philadelphia corridor, which is the border between Egypt and Gaza, which has provoked intense condemnation from Egypt and is also being blamed by a majority of the public and especially the families of the Israeli hostages. That condition of Netanyahu's is being blamed for the lack of a hostage release and ceasefire deal.
Ricky, we're also seeing criticism for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the Knesset. One member, Ofer Kassif, that's his name, says the assault on the occupied West Bank has nothing to do with Israel's security. He describes the government as being led by fascists like Netanyahu, Smotrich, he's mentioned earlier, and then the others who are not interested in the security of anyone in Israel. How true are these feelings in the Knesset?
Well, Ofer Kassif is a very far left member of the Knesset, so his opinion doesn't represent any majority at all. But what is significant is today the leader of the opposition, Yair Lapid, who leads the second largest party in the Knesset in the opposition, accused Prime Minister Netanyahu of having ignored warnings before October 7th from the security and intelligence community about what could happen in Gaza. And Lapid said that he attended joint security meetings with Netanyahu and saw that he was bored by these assessments and chose to ignore them, which is kind of a bombshell revelation, although in the political situation in Israel, in which the coalition has enough votes to stay in power despite anything that the opposition may say, it doesn't really matter in terms of the future of Israeli politics.
And where are we now with the peace talks? The one that the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Israel and in Qatar to help to midwife just a couple of weeks ago, in light of what has happened with Israel's attacks on the West Bank?
I don't think that the West Bank attacks are being connected by the decision maker in Gaza, who is Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza. He may not even know what's going on in the West Bank because he is deep inside tunnels. And so they say that getting word to him or from him regarding ceasefire and hostage release deals can take a matter of weeks before word gets in or out. And I don't think that he is really concerned with what's going on in the West Bank. It's uncertain whether he's concerned with what's going on in Gaza either, because he chooses to continue resisting any attempts to negotiate a deal, as well as Prime Minister Netanyahu, who resists the deal. And at this point, nobody can really say whether it seems to be stuck. And everybody is blaming the other side, but in any event, it's not moving forward.
I can imagine. I can imagine that, Riki, how stalled the talks could be at this point. And of course, the Hamas terrorists do have a reason to hold on to those hostages now, don't they? They could also play this up, even though you say it has no relations with the peace talks going on in Qatar, the attacks on the West Bank, and they could also claim the lives of civilians are at stake as a result of this. Have we also confirmed that there are no hostages being held in the West Bank, perhaps who might be in danger of, losing their lives in this operation by Israel?
Israeli hostages in the West Bank?
Yes, the possibility of having any Israeli hostages in the West Bank.
No. The hostages that are being negotiated for are all in Gaza. But the Palestinian prisoners whose release is part of the ceasefire hostage release negotiations, there are three parts: hostage release, Israeli hostage release, ceasefire in Gaza, and the release of potentially thousands of Palestinian prisoners who are from the West Bank and will go back to the West Bank. So there is that connection between the peace talks and the situation in the West Bank.
Ricky, thanks again for speaking with us on The World Today.
Thank you.